A Town on the Night by Arthur Telling. I sit today at a classy restaurant overlooking the San Francisco Bay. Above me, I see three slow-turning horizontal fans, and I feel a slight breeze on my face. Outside, through an array of quaint 80-year-old window panes, is the bay. A marina crowded with various kinds of boats lies outside. It is picturesque, a perfect place for writing, enjoying company, or vacationing. The moment will, in time, end and become a memory. And but for this, the memory, the charming instant would be lost. We find happiness in these moments, but happiness cannot be sustained except by an unbroken link of pleasurable events, and is gone when our world turns mundane from repetition or sours from heartache. The fans, like faithful servants, continue their slow, rhythmic spin as I write. The room is alive with activity. I see a waiter serving patrons. There are perhaps 20 faces here, each one feeling the gentle breeze of the fans, and each one experiencing the beauty of the outside bay and marina. The moment is exceptional for me, but maybe just lunch to others. But it is exceptional, as is every moment. With my left hand, I scribble words across a paper notebook, catching my present thought and preserving it in time. My other hand reaches for my drink. It is pungent and fruity. I am the artist painting a picture. The drink will impact my words, as will the song that is playing in the background. Bebop, or perhaps it is jazz. A magnificent canvas surrounds me in every direction I look. All is in perfect perspective. Tables converge toward a natural vanishing point. People walk about, becoming larger as they draw nearer, and smaller as they move away. Without perspective, the world would appear chaotic. Too many things would be in view, all having equal stature. I continue to paint, drawing no attention to myself. I am observing. A waiter comes toward me and becomes larger and larger until he is about equal to me in size and stature. He addresses me. Now I am the subject. Do I want another drink? No. My moment in the spotlight is over. The waiter grows smaller, obeying the law of perspective. Because I am cognizant of my surroundings today, I can concentrate on my movements and make an effort to perfectly balance my actions and thoughts. I cannot and will not reflexively move my arm or a finger. At this hour, I am attentive. Observing others, I can see that they seem lost in their activity, doing things without contemplating on what they are doing. Do I look like this to them, or am I the enlightened one? Taking my glass carefully, I know I am the enlightened one, for this moment anyway. It is not difficult to see the purpose on a person. Two young females are here to eat and talk. A single man sits drinking a Coke, looking happy with his solitude. A girl is explaining something of apparent importance to a younger boy. Waiters mull about, making effort to please customers. It is activity, and it is good. We are forever embedded in a reality of activity. I've not finished my drink. I am in no hurry. Were I, the challenge would be greater. Activity awaits me at every juncture and wants to gobble me up. The next great juncture is me finishing my drink and making an exit, and it will happen soon. Still in perfect balance, I look toward the door and contemplate what will await me. The door is small because it is at a distance, not presently the subject. I plan to see it turn larger and larger until it becomes overbearing and then disappears, which will happen when I walk through it. And I must do this to leave the restaurant. I feel my writing pen in my hand and I feel pressure from the table against my arm. I feel the chair below, and at my back my feet are pressed against my shoes. I am realizing the finer points of myself, something I would not ordinarily do. I am focusing on nerve endings, which are there telling me where my body ends and other things start. Perfect balance requires a gentle awareness of what is in our sphere of perception. We must utilize our minds as a painter strokes the canvas, never with an idle or not thought through moment. Then we create a masterpiece, not the average work of a typical man. Use your inherent perspective. The subject becomes larger, an eye-catcher on your canvas, and peripherals fade, but always supporting the subject. I am listening to a pleasant jazz song now. It is the subject, overpowering but dependent on the activity in the room. I take a sip of my drink. It is subservient to the music. It is smaller. Bob, do you have change for a 20? Rings out, breaking the ambience. For a brief second, the voice was the subject. I take another drink, and the drink is this time the subject. Soon the music regains a deserving center place. Perspective emanates from us in every direction. With distance, objects become smaller, and sound and sense fade, as does color. We cannot focus on too many things at once. There can be just a single subject at a given time, whether it is a thought, music, objects, or persons. Our self quite automatically does this for us. A good artist will compose a scene to get the effect he is looking for, and he can create eye-catching products from seemingly mundane subjects. You and I can do the same with any waking moment. I will paint a picture with words. Better, I will begin writing a novel. I will make the initial subject the room, which I will describe accurately and in detail. I will then spin off a fictitious tale. Our imaginations allow us to tell a yarn, making up a story entirely, or perhaps entwining make-believe with facts. Fiction is useful for communicating an idea. I can liven up an otherwise boring tale, but we should be careful to identify it as fiction and not confuse it with fact. The truth, not fiction, measures the worth of our efforts, and only the truth will identify our notable qualities. We do not do something by thinking it, we do it by doing it. Conversely, an inability to recognize our creative bent will limit us to the four plain walls that almost always surround us. We do something by imagining it before doing it, or sometimes imagining something before not doing it. I was enjoying my lunchtime drink at the nice Italian restaurant on the marina near where I worked. A white cloth covered the table. On my left were two sparkling forks neatly placed beside a white cloth napkin, and beside them was a small plate for dipping the French bread that sat in a silver-colored plate at the far middle of the table. To my right was a matching knife, and near it two clear corked bottles, about 3/4 full, one olive oil, the other vinegar. A large glass set in front of me, placidly full of water. and ice, and a thin lemon peel floating on top. No artist could have painted a more pleasing picture, with a bright blue cloudy sky and still water bay rippling through the window and boats in the harbor motionlessly awake. Behind the boats was a small hill which harbored the marina, not one of San Francisco's famous 42 hills, but of nearly equal stature, I surmised. To the right were a group of nautical-looking buildings, and behind them were two giant wire-frame horses, the magnificent Port of Richmond cranes, where steel containers from ocean-going ships are lifted and unloaded. I was not expecting company on this mild day. I had only wanted to get away from my job for an hour and have a nice 12-to-1 lunch. I could not have even begun to foresee that my world was about to be abruptly turned upside down. The only parallel I can give you is Jack London's novel, The Sea Wolf, which began with a man and woman on a commuter ferry having pleasant conversation before a horrific collision threw them into the sea, to be picked up by a half-mad captain of a whaling ship who would make them accompany him on a mysterious and brutal seagoing voyage. There was no ferry and no collision on this day, though, and it innocently began when a rather haggard-looking fellow, seeing me writing intensely at my table, asked if he could join me. I motioned for him to sit down, and I put down my pen, waiting for the curious-looking man to speak. He had a grayish-white full beard. His eyes were round, wide open, and bloodshot, and he was chubby, his belly exposed between his red and white striped T-shirt and well-worn blue jeans. I pictured him as Jack London's cook on the Sea Wolf, or less romantically, a retired old Santa Claus. I offered to buy him a drink, but he refused. He called himself Granger, then waved to the waiter and ordered us both a beer. Granger pointed out the window to the marina and said, "That's my baby there," which I would later find to be a good-sized sailboat docking along a row of boats. I told him I was writing about the metaphysical. His eyes lit up, and a broad smile crossed his face. He looked at me in the eye and said his boat could tell me more about the spirit than could any religion, Freud, or God. "You got to live it," he beamed in a powerful, burly voice, "or you won't ever know it." I became quite excited because this was exactly what I had been thinking. So I snapped up his offer to meet him and come aboard his boat the following Saturday for an excursion out into the bay. I'd never before been on a sailboat, so it would be quite a treat. The day was brisk and sunny. I brought along my thick spiral notebook, anticipating a lot to write. Granger waved as I approached and motioned me to come aboard. It was early, the sun shining brightly over a few gently flowing clouds. A steady sea breeze gave me an exotic feeling as I fathomed how this remarkable day might unfold. Granger glanced at my notebook in hand and said, "Good, you'll need that," waving me toward the boat. Looking closely now, I could see it was old and in disrepair. Its eggshell-colored paint was peeling, and the dark green trim was chipping off and revealing a brown undercolor from earlier paint. I looked at the stern and saw in green letters, "The Sea Wolf, Point Richmond, California," and I giggled as I reminisced over my thoughts about Granger upon first meeting him at the restaurant, but I wondered why the home port didn't simply read Richmond where we were. There must be some greater point, I mused silently. I asked Granger if he was a fan of Jack London. He was, he said, and pointed jovially at the name on his boat. It was cramped inside, but comfortable. Granger asked me if I had ever sailed before, and I told him that I hadn't. "We're about to travel into the unknown," he beamed, and I believed it. There was a mystery about him, as though he knew something that I didn't, and that few people did. More and more, I was determining that I would learn it too. Granger said we wouldn't be going far, and he wasn't hoisting the sail. I felt disappointment, having imagined a thrilling seafaring voyage and stopover at some tiny island paradise. "Don't cry," Granger said in his typical gruff, low voice. "I told you you're gonna learn something spiritual, and that you will." Granger fixed me a cup of instant coffee and got up, telling me he was untying the boat. I nodded and sipped on the coffee, knowing to stay put. My lack of any boating experience would have made me a liability rather than a help. With the ropes untied, the boat floated backward from the dock, and I could hear Granger trying to start the diesel engine. It sputtered a few times and then caught, seeing a plume of black fumes up from into the now almost cloudless sky. I figured that the engine must have been in as bad repair as was the paint, for it made quite a racket, pounding feverishly and drowning out the gentle caws of the seagulls that were circling the boat. The boat slowly puttered out of the harbor, and a good feeling engulfed me as I began respecting the deep rhythmic sound of the pounding engine. We were on our way to I knew not where. It was quite exhilarating watching the harbor grow smaller and smaller as we parted the Richmond Marina, where I had spent so many hours pondering over the question of why I must live one day after the next, doing the same things in the same places. Now, not knowing where I was going, I felt finally I knew I would be going someplace. Granger peeked in the door and motioned me to come out. Before me was a stunning view of the bay. Far in the distance was the Golden Gate Bridge, standing majestically as it had for 70 years, and straight ahead was the San Francisco skyline, the bay glimmering under its feet. "Get ready," Granger said. "We are about to enter the abyss." And he laughed a loud, hearty laugh. It couldn't have been but 5 minutes when Granger yelled out, "Land ahoy!" I thought he was joking, but soon found that we were coming up fast on an old dock. Behind it was a small little house, or perhaps maybe a large shed. Granger brought the boat up to the dock, and as he grazed it, I watched splinters fly off the dock. It was rotten. Granger explained that the salt water does that to the wood. The water was relatively still. We were in some kind of a cove, away from civilization. Yet we had to be smack in the center of one of the most populated areas in the country. I wondered exactly where we were, and Granger, seemingly reading my thoughts, told me that we had left the real world and had entered a dream. You might guess that I became quite enthused, for I had read and heard that such things were possible, but not had much success in getting there. Was Granger on the level? Had he transported me to a dream world in broad daylight, somehow with his magical boat? Maybe, I thought. The dock was so dilapidated that I felt insecure taking the handrail, which moved a good several inches either way on just a slight pressure. I found the wood floor slat sagging as I walked, so I took larger steps to land on the crossboards. Granger, noticing, said, "Smart, son, it's the salt water. It rots the wood. Watch your step, son." And then he let out a burst of laughter. We made it to the solid ground, and I felt relief. Granger asked me if I'd ever dreamed about falling through an old rotten dock. I said I had not, and he said, "Well, you have now," again busting out with a great big laugh. It was becoming curiouser and curiouser, as Disney's Alice in Wonderland once famously said. We stood facing a small, run-down house, which I gathered must have been 75 years old, judging from the architecture. Granger pulled out a key of the old skeleton key variety, and I again imagined Alice in Wonderland. Alice this time grasping the old door handle that said, "Ow!" in Disney actor Keenan Wynn's voice. But this knob didn't utter a word when Granger grabbed and turned its nose with his big hand and then pushed hard on the door, which had become stuck from, I guess, the salt water that was rotting everything else around here. Granger said we would sleep here tonight, but it was still very early in the day. We walked into the kitchen, which looked like it hadn't been used in 5 years. Pots and pans were stacked up in the sink, but they looked clean, though caked with dust. Next to it was an old wood stove, and next to that was an icebox. My mom used to call our electric refrigerator an icebox. This icebox was an icebox. An icebox keeps things cold when somebody puts a chunk of ice in it. I wondered if this place had any electricity and asked Granger. "Electricity?" he remarked in a jovial way. "We don't need none of that now. You said you want to learn something about the spirit, and I'm going to show you something about the spirit. We don't need no electricity." "Why? You missing Sean Hannity on Fox News?" He let out again in his big burly laugh. It was strange, I thought, that we had so quickly come so far away from civilization. I was sitting here in what seemed a remote area that could not be more than 10 minutes away from my former bustling urban life. Where was I? Granger again read my mind and said I was the nowhere man who had just made it to nowhere land, repeating the lyrics of a popular old Beatles song. "You have," he said soberly, "walked into my dream, and you are here in my dream right up till it ends. Don't worry, lad, I'm going to take you around town and put you up here tonight and send you on your way in the morning. Don't you worry, boy." Granger had me liking him a lot now, and had me thinking that I had perhaps really been drawn into his dream. Granger waved me to come outside where an old flatbed truck sat next to the house, and he pointed for me to get in. I pulled on the handle. It was rusty, but it opened, and with a voluminous creak, the passenger side door swung out. I stepped up on the outside floorboard and climbed in. The dashboard was rusty, and a gaping hole existed where the radio should have been. Granger climbed in the driver's side and started the engine, which took several minutes to accomplish. The big puff of black smoke out the back reminded me of our initial departure from the Richmond harbor. Granger backed up the truck, turned it around, and started off on a narrow road. We came upon a small little tunnel burrowed through a hill, and we drove through. It opened broadly into an old western town, complete with saloons, old hotels, and churches. Granger really had brought me into a dream, I thought. Granger gracefully parallel parked the old truck. I followed him a half block to a tavern, and we went in. Everyone there seemed to know him. The bartender waved, and a waitress greeted him. The atmosphere was gay. Granger walked away and returned with a woman and a gruffy-looking old man. He motioned me towards the woman. She had long brown hair, looked about 30, and was pretty, though she was dressed plainly in blue slacks and a white sweater. "Sally would like to meet you," said Granger, but judging her reaction, I wasn't so sure that Sally was so anxious to meet me. She looked uncomfortable. I offered to buy her a drink, and she sat down. I'm not one for chatting, and I wasn't sure what to say, so I said, "Granger's quite a character, isn't he?" "I don't particularly like him. He's a bit too aggressive," she said. I hadn't before even thought about Granger's bold manners, and I did like him, and quite a lot. But trying to please Sally, I played along and agreed. I wanted her to like me. She began talking about the boredom of this little town and said she wished she could get away to the big city. "It's just 5 minutes away by boat," I hammered out. She looked perplexed. "I've been here all my life," she said, "and wouldn't know the first thing about leaving. And Mom's old now. I could never leave her here alone by herself." From there, Sally recounted her life story about growing up in this little town that's in the middle of nowhere, yet next door to everywhere. And my fondness of her grew. I told her about my writing and how I was exploring the metaphysical. She seemed uneasy. "A band comes in here at 3, she said, suggesting that I stick around. "I'm not much for dancing," I replied, "but I like good music." "Perhaps you shouldn't waste your afternoon, then. They aren't really that good," she replied. Granger appeared, rescuing us from an awkward discussion, and told me to get up so that he could show me around the town. Sally shrugged her shoulders. "See you later, Huck." She was referring to wrestler Huck Hogan and was obviously making fun of my small build. I was starting to think that maybe I didn't really like Sally that much. Granger and I walked out. The sunlight blinded me. "We'll walk up this hill," he said. "You'll get a good view of the water and can maybe put something nice in your notebook." I had been tightly holding the notebook without realizing it, but hadn't written a word in it yet. Granger pointed up the street. As we began walking, Granger said that getting there is always half the fun, referring to a popular old quote. It reminded me of a short book I had once read about going to the moon. "Getting there is half the fun," it read, continuing. "Getting there may be all the fun because there isn't really much to do on the moon." Granger reminded me that whether we were going somewhere or have arrived somewhere, we are living life, and living life is all that we do. We should not think we are going somewhere. We are somewhere. "You and I are walking up this street," said Granger. "There is nothing more to see than what we see here now. Look off to your right." He was speaking of a grand old hotel across the street. "Look again," he said. "You aren't really seeing it." "It is quite a majestic hotel," I replied. "You don't see the grand opening, nor do you see the years that it has set there on that spot that it's on," said Granger. "On the crash of 29, there were people in there who picked up the morning paper and read the big story of the day. Market crash. You don't see that, but you should see it." Crash of 29, I wondered, curious. I understood what Granger meant, though, and I knew that he knew what I knew already, that I knew it, but could not live it. I could not see the hotel. Yet I sensed what he was getting at. The hotel is alive with history. Many souls have traveled there, and each of them holds a memory of it. The hotel is, in a sense, eternal. It will live on long past its eventual demolition. "It is good to preserve history," Granger said, interrupting my thoughts about the hotel. "For any old building or thing holds in it the feelings that were ever there." Yes, I replied, thinking to myself how this old town was preserved in history like little old towns all across America. It is something which most of us take for granted, the history behind Main Street and the things that founded the communities where we live. It takes a tourist to find an interest in a town's history. Granger was no tourist, but no ordinary man either. You and I didn't just emerge out of nowhere, and unless you lived next door to Walmart or Target, the things you see didn't either. I followed Granger back to the truck and we climbed in. The late afternoon sun was beating down on the dashboard, and I distinctly noticed the old paint glittering on the dashboard, worn from a deep purple at the edges to a dull gray in the middle. It shook as the first spark plug fired. He turned his wheels and rumbled onto the street. We went through the tunnel, and as we emerged from it, I began thinking about Sally. She had been rude to me, but her candor had excited me, and I wanted to see her again. I mentioned to Granger that I had a good time at the bar, subtly hinting that I'd like to go back there. Reading my thoughts behind the words, Granger said we had to get back now to start the fireplace at the old shack, as he called it, but there would be plenty of time to revisit my new friend Sally. It was twilight when we got back to the old house by the dock. Granger motioned me to the back, behind the house, on the side of the water. It was overgrown with weeds. We waded through and came up to a wood pile, maybe 4 feet high and 8 feet across. He picked up an armful of wood, handed it to me, and again filled up his arms. I followed him back to the door, watching where I walked, for there were abundant obstacles, like barbed wire laying about, an old rusted car engine on its side next to the house, and various lengths of rusted pipes and other junk strewn about. Granger opened the door and suggested that I get some shut-eye, which suited me, for the unusual day was bringing me drowsiness. Granger pulled a blanket from a closet, handed it to me, and pointed to a bunk across the wall. I lay down. Sally popped into my mind. She had snagged me. I was not going to forget her. Laying straight up, I focused on the ceiling. It was open beam and in dire need of paint. Cobwebs hung off it just about everywhere. But I felt good. I guess I had drifted off, for I abruptly awakened, feeling the house shaking. A fierce storm was battering its old walls. I could hear rain coming down in sheets, and the wind gusting heavily. I jumped up, but was disoriented and dizzy. I looked around. It took a moment to gain my stability. Granger was asleep in a bunk across from me. I shook him gently, and he opened his eyes. "There's a storm out there," I said. "A what?" "Go back to sleep. It's early." He spoke in almost a whisper, and he chuckled quietly. I sat up for what seemed like an hour, watching storm and rain slap against the window, wondering if the storm was going to break the window pane or even blow the roof off this old shack. Somewhere I must have laid back down, because I next remembered waking to a pleasant sound of chirping birds. A broad ray of sunlight beamed in through the window, and I felt relaxed. I looked over at Granger, but his bed was empty. I got up. It was cold. I found Granger in the next room attempting to light the fireplace with a book of matches and some newspaper. "Welcome aboard," he said with a laugh. "Did you get a good sleep?" I said that I had, but for the storm. "Storm?" He looked puzzled. "You didn't hear it?" I said, feeling a bit worried. "It just about blew down the house." I hurried over to the front door and pulled it, but it didn't open. Just throw the bolt, said Granger. I did, and swung open the heavy door to find myself overwhelmed by a bright, cloudless sunshine morning. Nothing was out of place. Not a tree branch had fallen. A stack of old newspapers and cardboard boxes lined up by the wall looked dry and neat. It didn't look like there had been any storm. I told Granger about the big storm I had witnessed. He pointed at my notebook. You got to write down your dream quickly, he said, or you'll forget it. This was no dream, I told Granger. It was just like here, now, talking with you. It was real. Dreams are like that, he said. They are real. Your recollection of last night isn't quite so real, though. You felt the storm and it was real. Now you're talking to me, and that's real. Real is what's happening right now. Your storm was real, but now it isn't. You were dreaming. Besides, you're writing about a sea adventure, and no good sea story is without a storm. Granger busted into a laugh that lasted a full minute. He was right. The storm would be useful for recording my weekend experience. There's not much of a story to I went to bed and woke up the next morning. There's another aspect to your dream, Granger said, and it's why a good sea story has got to have a storm. Everything we see and do has a reason. We're writing a story as we live. That we're the actors on a big stage called life isn't no poetic secret. Your head's in turmoil, and your storm represented that. But you're figuring it out. You've read enough to understand it, but you can't yet live it. The storm showed it. And our nice sunny morning proves that you're making progress. You're going to win this one, kid, for the Gipper. And he again busted out laughing. I was beginning to accept that the storm had indeed been merely a dream. We sat and chatted by the fire, sipping coffee and eating crackers and salami. Ranger got up and said it was time to be getting back. You have that job you love so much to get back to, he said, grinning, knowing that I hated it. I suggested that we go back into town once more so that I could say goodbye to Sally. No time for that today, he said, and you already did that last night. Granger was again right, for I had felt a lot of dream state activity happening during the night, and I had recollections of seeing Sally. We walked out the door, and he put back the small rusty padlock that he had removed when we came in the day before. We headed toward the dock, and from a distance I saw, astonished, that a good 15 feet of the rotting wooden railings was completely gone, apparently having fallen off into the bay during the night. I pointed at the now diminished dock. Granger squinted to better see and replied, "Must have been that big storm," and laughed and laughed. I was extra careful traversing the dock, which was now becoming a real safety issue. Granger seemed to have no problem with it, but like I, strode in big steps to land each foot on the crossbeams that supported the weaker planking. The boat hadn't seemed to have incurred a bit of damage from the night, but it would have been hard to notice anyway, given its condition. We climbed aboard. Granger told me to untie the back rope, and with some effort I did. We began to drift. Granger started the engine, which again emitted a lot of black smoke and noise, and we were off. Granger was whistling, "Sailing, sailing over the bounding main." The breeze was cool, seagulls were above cawing pleasantly, and I felt really good. Am I dreaming now, I wondered. I figured that I might as well be, because life doesn't often feel this invigorating. We puttered back toward the Richmond harbor. The giant horses were off to my left, and I could see the Italian restaurant emerging behind the marina. Granger told me that there would be no need to run off quickly. It was early, and he'd buy me a drink. We docked the boat and got off. I felt like I'd been away for a month, but it had been barely more than a day. Sally and Granger's other friends seemed almost a mystery now, as though I had merely dreamed the whole thing. What was this little town that we had visited? I was glad that Granger had offered me the drink, because I needed one to wind down. We went into the restaurant. The waitress recognized me and ushered us to the back room, and we sat down at a small table laid out with silverware for one. I ordered a coffee, and Granger did too. I set my notebook on the table, looked out at the marina, and then at Granger's smiling face. Above us were the 3 horizontal ceiling fans. They were running. I looked at my watch. It was 12:50 p.m., almost the same time that I had first met Granger. Looking about, I realized that we were seated in the exact same chairs that I and Granger had sat in on the Thursday noontime when I met him. It was as though I had imagined the whole story. Perhaps there was no little frontier town, no tavern, no Sally, and certainly there had been no storm. Only Granger was real. He was sitting here sipping coffee with me. Yes, Granger was real, but the rest I had imagined. The waitress came to take our orders, and I asked her what day it was. "It's Thursday," she said. Puzzled, I turned my head toward the window and looked out at the bay. It was supposed to be Sunday. I looked back and saw an empty chair where Granger had been, and just one empty coffee cup. Et tu, Brutes? Had Granger been my imagination too? Granger, too, had been my imagination, as was the frontier town, Sally, and the storm. But I had the experience recorded and protected in my notebook. I would again see Sally, I knew, for Sally is as real as my notebook. Sadly, I closed my notebook, paid the waitress, and went back to my job. It was Thursday afternoon, and I would be a few minutes late from lunch.